Hello and welcome to the OTB channel. Choice and freedom are good things. There can't be many in the Linux community who would disagree with that statement. The problem is, one of the side effects of having choices is it can often divide people or polarize them, if you like, into separate camps. Now, that in itself isn't necessarily a bad thing, but often the people in those separate camps will be so convinced that they're right and others are wrong that we can have all sorts of arguments and drama, which ultimately aren't good for the community. Recently, there has been lots of drama around this whole issue of snaps and Flatpaks and container-inspired packages. And in this video, I'm just going to take a light touch look at what these things are and what the situation's all about, and actually whether it's even worth worrying about. See you after the intro. Okay, welcome back. So there's something inherently tribal about human beings. We like to divide into our own camps, and whenever we're given a choice, a large proportion of people will go to one camp or another, and although some people will be fence sitters and say, okay, well, it's great having choice, others will adopt a really strong position. And we see this throughout every aspect of human life, but perhaps it's more noticeable in the free software community because we have so many choices. And going all the way back from when I started using Linux, we had, well, the first thing that comes to mind is the big KDE versus Gnome wars with people on one side or another. And then, of course, there was the VI versus Emacs wars, flame wars, with people finding very little middle ground. I covered one of the other flame wars that there's been recently, System D versus the rest. And it seems to me that even though that seems to have died down a little bit now, that we keep hearing now about these new container-inspired packages, snaps, Flatpaks, and I haven't mentioned them here, but app images also fall into this category. What people think about them, whether they think they're a good thing or a bad thing, and more specifically, whether you should use one over the other. Let me state my position here before we go much further. I think generally that they are a good thing, and I think some of the advantages that you can get from using them are brilliant, and they solve a lot of problems, and we'll talk about that in a second. Which one ultimately ends up being the winner, if any, though, is a matter of hot debate. So let's get into this. Let's go to the combined screen, and then let's just broadly have a look at what we actually mean by these container-inspired packages. Okay, so what are these things, snaps and Flatpaks? And yes, app images, let's throw that into the mix. I'm not going to get too technical here, going into the ins and outs of exactly how each of these things works, other than to say the similarities are perhaps in many ways bigger than the differences, especially when you compare them to traditional package formats such as the deb files and the RPM files. So these are, whilst not a container in the sense of Docker, they are inspired by the container sort of paradigm, the format. They're not just a package in their own right. They are a package that comes bundled with the dependencies and libraries that package needs to run. And the great thing about this is it means that a Flatpak or a snap is not necessarily dependent on the libraries that are already installed on the system that you are running it on. So just to give you an example here, I have run the latest version of OBS Studio on Debian Stable, and because Debian Stable doesn't actually contain the latest version of OBS Studio, the easiest choice for me was to install the Flatpak, which doesn't require all the libraries that the latest version of OBS Studio depends upon, because they come bundled within that container or package, if you like. So they make things very easy. And because they will run on multiple systems, it doesn't really matter whether that system is a Deb-based system, an RPM-based system, or even an Arch system. You can run snaps and Flatpaks. There is a caveat here. Snaps will only run on systemd systems, but Flatpaks and app images don't have that restriction. How do these things work? Well, to a greater or lesser extent, they can all use this concept of sandboxing, where they run as an independent entity. It doesn't mean that they are completely walled off from the rest of your system. They obviously need access to certain parts of the system in order to be functional. Can you imagine running a particular package that didn't have access to, for instance, your home folder, where you needed to access other files or packages that are on there? And often they'll need access to things like Wayland or X11 in order to run properly. And that in itself can be problematic as far as security is concerned, because this sandbox essentially has to have holes punched in it to ensure that these packages can function. But ultimately, they can run in a sandbox which gives it a layer of security that perhaps other apps don't necessarily have, and they have the dependencies bundled together within the package, and you don't have to make a choice. You can have a system that runs app images, snaps, Flatpaks, and standard Deb or RPM packages. So it sounds like a good thing, doesn't it, on the whole? It sounds like we might actually be getting away from this issue that you either run a Deb system or an RPM system, and you can only install packages which have a Deb version or have an RPM version. Well, those problems are gone. You can just install a snap, a Flatpak, or an app image. Well, yes and no. Let's have a look at the advantages. So what are the advantages of using these packages? Well, the biggest advantage is for developers or companies who produce software, and they want to get their particular application distributed across as many Linux distros as possible. Now, let's just take Ubuntu for a prime example. They support multiple versions of their operating system. So you have your LTS releases and you have all the other ones in between. If they just stuck to producing a Deb package for all those applications, they're going to have to develop a Deb package for each of those different versions, which will all no doubt have different dependencies based on different versions of libraries. That problem is taken away by having something like a snap, because the same snap will run on every single version. So if you're running an LTS release and it's getting to the point of 2 years old, because of snaps, you can still be running up-to-date software. So that's a huge advantage. Let's think of independent software developers as well. If they wanted to develop a package for Linux, they would have to make the choice about, well, in what format do we develop this? Do we produce a Deb, an RPM? Do we produce an Arch version of the package? How are we going to do that? Well, with the introduction of these distro-independent packages, they no longer have that issue. they can just create a snap, or they can create a Flatpak or an app image, and they only have to create the one package. It can then be distributed across multiple different distros of different ages. So it makes the whole process of software development so much easier. It really does. I think personally that if we're ever going to get some of the big proprietary companies developing their software for Linux, let's talk Microsoft for an instance, and Microsoft Office as an example. I would imagine that if it ever comes, it will come in the form of a snap or a Flatpak. And the same could be said if Adobe ever go the same way, although they don't seem to be showing that much inclination so far. But obviously it's going to be easier. I mean, I know that people may not see that as an advantage. Why on earth would you want to get proprietary software on a Linux system? Well, sometimes the restraints of work would just make it a lot easier. An example that I have, for instance, is my company, the company I work for full-time, has moved towards using Microsoft Teams for all conference calls. Now, it doesn't matter whether you think that's a good package or a bad package. The fact is that I have to use it for work. And the choice I have is either to run my Windows laptop and use it from there, or an option which is far more convenient for me is to run it from my Linux system, which is likely to be up and running as well. Well, luckily, you can do that now. You can install Microsoft Teams by Snap or by Flatpak, and I've got to tell you, it works pretty good. So there are certain advantages here. They're making the barrier to entry into the Linux ecosystem much easier for software companies and developers. And for the user, well, there are advantages as well. I mean, they're easy to install. There's no dependency hell. For instance, as you know, I run Slackware on one of my laptops. Slackware Current, in fact, I'm running at the moment, and it was stable, but I've upgraded. And it's not always possible to easily install a particular package on Slackware. It doesn't do automatic dependency resolution. Luckily, though, you can install the Flatpak package, and suddenly all those problems are gone. If I need up-to-date software to run on my Slackware system without having to go into compilation and compile the package from source, I can just install a Flatpak. So there's a big convenience aspect here. And I can run the latest software on my version of Debian Stable, which is great. I don't need the latest software for everything, but there are some packages where I do really need the latest version for some of the features. So, yeah, installing the latest apps on older systems is certainly an advantage for users. I'm pleased to say that all the formats are widely supported as well, so it doesn't really matter which distro that you're using. In fact, this notion that some people are putting forward that distros don't really matter, it sort of tends to support that notion. It's not something I completely agree with, but certainly we're going towards that. If we're just using a standardized package format, it takes away the issue of, well, if I want to run such and such a package, I'll have to run Debian or Ubuntu. And last but not least, it means that you get a consistent experience running a particular app on whatever system you're running it on. Wow, there's a lot here, isn't there? There's a lot in favour of snaps, Flatpaks, and app images. And I'll be honest, I've used all of them. Obviously, snaps only run on System D systems. I have run them, but I've tended to use Flatpaks by default. App images are a bit of a strange one for me, and I've not had as much success in them running, especially on Slackware. but essentially they're completely self-contained. They're just like a self-mounting ISO file. You make it executable and you run, and everything that you need is included within that framework. They don't seem to be as popular as snaps and Flatpaks, but nevertheless they're a contender. But the fact that they don't necessarily integrate as well with an existing desktop environment is perhaps why they haven't become as popular in our perception as they perhaps deserve to be. So from what I've said so far, you might be thinking to yourself, well, sounds like a good thing. It's given us an additional choice or additional set of choices, and the advantages seem to be pretty good. You know, I can understand why people use them and why perhaps Ubuntu has gone down the route of more and more snaps, because they can support all of the different systems that they need to support without having to develop different packages for each one. Unfortunately, that's only half the story, as I'm sure you're aware, because there are disadvantages as well. Let's go back and have a look at them. So with all the advantages of these universal package systems, what are the disadvantages? Well, there are a range, and I should start this by saying that many of these have been tackled over the last few years, and they're becoming less of an issue. But desktop integration has been one of the big things. Initially, when you ran a Snap or a Flatpak, you'd often run it and it wouldn't quite look the same as the other packages on your system. This has been worked on and is now less of an issue, but nevertheless, they don't always have exactly the look and feel that you would perhaps hope for. I've also noticed with snaps that are very much developed with Ubuntu in mind, that if I install a snap package on vanilla Debian or on Arch, they don't automatically add themselves onto the menu. And I found that I had to create a little script to make sure that happened automatically. In fact, if you have a look past on my past videos, you'll see where I've talked about that. So desktop integration, yeah, there are a few quirks here and there, but it's getting better. Updates are a sort of different matter. Yes, if you've got the Ubuntu software store or you use Gnome software, the chances are that updates aren't going to be an issue. With snaps in particular, the underlying system or library that is called snapd will automatically update your snaps on a daily basis, I believe. Not quite the same thing with Flatpaks. If you have the Gnome software store, yes, automatic updates will happen. But if you're running something like Slackware or Arch, I find that I have to manually update these apps via the command line, because there is no mechanism installed on my systems that would allow for that auto-updating. It's not a big issue, but it's just an additional step. There is, of course, a concern here that the libraries bundled within these packages may not be as up-to-date as perhaps they should be, and there should be maybe some security flaws in some of those libraries that really need updating. And this opens up the whole issue of security, which we'll come on to in a second. Size? Well, yeah, they are bigger than your traditional RPM or deb package. Of course they are, because they have all these additional libraries bundled into them. App images seem, from what I've just been reading, to be the smallest, but when it comes to snaps and Flatpaks, there's a lot of variation. And without a doubt, they are many times larger than their equivalent deb or RPM package or legacy. Should I even use the word legacy with the standard packages? Let's just call them the standard package systems. Not perhaps such a huge issue these days. Storage is cheap. We have terabytes worth of storage, so does it really matter? That's really something that only you can decide, and if you haven't got a lot of space, it could be a major concern. Speed? Well, initially when I started using these a year or two ago, I noticed that they were incredibly slow to start, and they tended to be a little bit more sluggish and use more system resources than a standard package. That problem is another of those that seems to be getting better. Yes, there is a slight delay to them launching compared to a traditional package, but once they're up and running, I have to say that honestly, I haven't noticed much difference. In terms of making everything a Flatpak or a snap, though, you've got to ask yourself, small, tiny packages like Gnome calculator, etc., is there much point in making a universal package for something like that? And I would say no. Right, so we come on to security, and when you do a search about the security of Flatpaks and snaps, etc., you'll come across loads of articles. I mean, I suppose the famous one a few years ago was when Canonical found that one of the snaps in its Snapcraft store had actually got crypto mining software built into it. So there was a big hoo-ha about that. And in terms of Flatpaks, well, we also read a lot about how secure the sandbox is. And some people have suggested that actually most apps don't even really use the sandbox. They can be set up with certain permissions, and often it's just tantamount to running as a normal package with no sandbox at all. I'm not going to go into the ins and outs of that, other than to say that the criticisms have been taken on board, they've been worked on, and I think from an outsider's point of view, they seem to be less of an issue now than perhaps they were initially. Last but not least, I've put this category under ethics. I don't know if that's the right word, if I'm honest, but it's about whether or not they conform to the standards of free and open source software that I suppose we've come to expect of Linux in general. And one of the major issues here is that Snapcraft, which is the store, the Ubuntu or Canonical owned store, the centralized repository for snaps, is proprietary. Now, Ubuntu will insist that there are reasons for that. A lot of it's to do with the legacy of where the Snapcraft technology came from. And they've argued that actually it doesn't mean that it won't be open sourced in the future, but would there be any advantages of doing it straight away? I'm not even going to get into it. The fact is, it has a proprietary element. And the fact that it has a proprietary element has meant that many people are put off using snaps and have used Flatpaks or app images instead. I'd be the first to admit that quick look at advantages and disadvantages has been very sweeping. It wasn't meant to be a detailed look at all the minutiae behind the various arguments, many of which, I have to say, passed straight over my head. So it's more about key themes. And just picking up on the security thing, I do have to say that we can get ourselves in a knot about the security of snaps and Flatpaks and app images. But many of us, with our distros of choice, perhaps take decisions which are not exactly secure every day. I'm an Arch user. I use packages from the AUR. There could be anything there. Yes, there's a degree of I suppose, self-discipline, in as much as if a package has something wrong with it, it'll soon be found out. But nevertheless, you can't guarantee that AUR software is going to run properly, and and not interact with the rest of your system and tear it into little pieces. Ubuntu PPAs, there's another one. Fill your system full of PPAs, and just by doing that, you probably make it less secure. So we make decisions about security all the time, and those decisions are often based on whether or not we want a particular piece of software. And in order to get that particular piece of software, we are prepared to make an informed decision about taking a particular risk. I grant you not all decisions will be informed, but nevertheless, that's how things stand. Overall, my view is that these universal package formats are a good thing. I like to have the option of using them if I need to. I wouldn't choose them by default because I prefer a smaller package and to use my distribution's packaging system out of choice, which is just automatically updated with the standard CLI commands. But I do see the benefits. The problem is, whilst we have these additional choices, they themselves have caused a number of problems. So why are all these extra choices a problem in itself? Well, we now have Flatpaks, we now have snaps, we now have app images, and to be honest, I wouldn't be surprised if we don't see another fork or the development of yet another universal package somewhere along the line. But if you come all the way back to what one of the main benefits was of these universal packages, it was mainly about developers more than anything else, that it gave developers the option that they could just develop one package and it would run on multiple distros, no matter what the age of those distros was. Well, in many ways, by having these different universal package managers, we've still got that problem. They now have to decide, well, they don't just produce a snap or a Flatpak or an app image. They have to decide which one they're going to do. And of course, it may well be the case that if they decide on a particular format, that might not be supported by another distro. I'm thinking here about Linux Mint preventing the installation of Snapd, and we'll come to that in a minute. But nevertheless, there is a contradiction here. We love choice, we like having the option, but sometimes all of those options can do away with the benefits that these new things were meant to provide. And this contradiction will always be there. Kind of coming away from universal packages, there are some out there who think we should have a single standardized Linux distribution that everybody uses. I know one of the people I watch on YouTube, TOS, Total Operating System Today, is a big proponent of that. I can see the advantages that it gets rid of the fragmentation within the Linux ecosystem, but personally, I would hate that. And if a Linux standard distribution were ever developed by anyone and started to dominate the market, I would run a mile to the smallest independent distro I could find, because I would want no part of it. I would still want there to be a choice. The last thing I would ever want is for the Linux world to become another Microsoft or another Apple. But those who want to appeal to a wider market would see that as a great benefit. So there's that inbuilt contradiction between choice and ultimately what people want to happen in the long run. There's also the fact that as these packages become more and more popular, they effectively decrease our choice. And I'll use Ubuntu as an example here. A huge proportion of that distribution is now based on snaps, which minimizes the possibility of installing other packages, especially the old deb packages. If you install an Ubuntu system, you're going to install a system with snaps. And yes, I know that technically if you install a server, the minimal server, you can remove snapd. But nevertheless, most people aren't going to do that. You are going to get a system that is basically built on snaps. And does that really matter? Well, it depends on your viewpoint. Many people won't see it as a disadvantage. And certainly for Ubuntu, the increasing popularity and usage of Snap makes a lot of sense from a corporate and a development point of view. But as a user, yes, it decreases our choice. There's also the fact that we're just seeing constant debates at the moment, increasing polarization. You know, what's wrong with snaps? What's wrong with Flatpaks? Why aren't we using app image? And we're all dividing into different camps, it seems. I personally feel like I'm a fence sitter because I don't much care as long as they work. But I personally still want to be able to use standard Debs or Arch or RPM packages wherever I can, because I prefer it to have a smaller footprint and I like the ease of updating. But nevertheless, these debates are going on, and some of them are getting quite nasty. The Linux Mint one that's recently happened is probably fresh in everybody's mind, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. So, yeah, polarization and debate. Now, in many ways, debates are a good thing. You know, you hope that the evidence is presented from both sides, and eventually whoever has the strongest evidence, who makes the strongest points, they will win, and the winner will emerge, and the winner will be the one that deserved to win. That's quite a naive viewpoint. Firstly, winners don't always emerge. This polarization and debate could go on for years and years and years and never end. But if one does eventually win, I personally think it's probably going to be Snaps, because it has the power of Ubuntu, which, let's face it, is the biggest distro out there. It has that behind it. I think Snaps will eventually take over and become the dominant universal package. Now, that doesn't mean it's right. If you go all the way back, an example I've got from outside the Linux world is when they first introduced videos, you know, the video recorder. And there was two formats. There was VHS and Betamax. Technically, Betamax was a better format. VHS, however, was cheaper to produce. The producers of VHS managed to persuade all of the video stores to hold VHS copies of videos rather than Betamax videos. And eventually, and it was cheaper to produce VHS video machines. And eventually, Betamax, well, it just became, you know, a historical thing that happened. It was technically the better format, but the other party won because there was other things in its favour. Okay, so that's a bit off subject, but what I'm trying to say is debates and battles don't always result in the right side winning, even if the other side have won the arguments along the way. And a big example of the nastiness, I suppose, of what can happen is what we've just seen with the Ubuntu and Linux Mint guys. Linux Mint weren't initially against snaps, but what they didn't want was for Ubuntu to essentially control the complete distribution of software to people who were using their base as a foundation. And one of the things that seems to have sparked it all is the Chromium web browser. What Ubuntu did is that they actually replaced the Chromium deb package with a snap. And if you did an apt install Chromium, what would actually happen is behind the surface, the system would actually install the snap package of Chromium. So that caused a great deal of worries, especially as it did it all in a sort of underhand way as far as Linux Mint was concerned. So bottom line is what actually happened is Linux Mint blocked the installation of snapd, and although it is possible to re-enable it, as it stands in its default format, you won't be running snaps if you run Linux Mint, even though it's based on Ubuntu. What is my view about this? Well, I sort of understand where the Linux Mint developers are coming from, and I would also say that I do think it's a little bit underhand doing things like this to, I would say, to Ubuntu. But ultimately, Canonical and Ubuntu, they can do what they want. It's their distro. You know what they're doing. You make your choices. And if Linux Mint don't like it, well, they can take action as they have, or they can just go to Debian. Yeah, why not go to Debian? Just move bases. So, choice, yes, they give us more choice, but in many ways they've resulted in a more complicated situation that has not exactly been positive for the community so far. Let's go and have a chat. Right, so it's difficult to get away from the fact that whilst I generally believe these universal distro-agnostic packages are a good thing, they're tied up with that issue of choice. And choice is really important. From the developer's perspective, it would probably be better if there wasn't a choice and we just had one single package format. I personally feel that Snaps is probably best placed to take that position if there are any winners. From a personal preference point of view, though, if there were to be any winners, I think I would prefer Flatpak for a couple of reasons. One, that it's not tied into any sort of proprietary platform, and two, it doesn't depend on systemd, so it has wider applicability as far as distros are concerned. Overall, though, I find it hard to criticise something that gives us extra choice, even if it does create all sorts of issues in between. So I thought I'd just give you my view of this. And I know that I've swept over what can be a very complex situation, but sometimes you've got to distill these things just to have a chat. So guys, I'm going to call it a day from here. Don't forget to join me on Library. Come and have a chat with us on the Facebook group. And I'd like to end by saying a big thank you to my patrons who are constantly growing. My list is getting bigger and bigger. Thank you so much, guys. I'd like to say thank you to the newest member, Gary Moore, who's come on as a premium member. But we now have Corbinian Schilderman as an executive member coming, well, he came across a few weeks ago. He's now in the top tier. Also, Robert Boudreau, who's a supporting member. And of course, I don't want to forget everybody who supports the channel. So Aristotelis, Papa Giorgio, Stormpix, Stephen Cross, Mike Long, David Bird, Entropy UK, Richard Wade, Tiger, and Philip Espy. I can't believe there's 12 of you now, guys. You are the people who are going to make this channel all it can be over the next year. Thank you so much. Guys, thanks for watching the video. Hope you enjoy it. And I'll see you next week.